The storm came down from the peaks without warning. 1 hour the sky was the flat gray of November slate. The next it was white, not the soft white of a gentle snowfall, but the hard driving white of a Colorado blizzard that had made up its mind about something and intended to finish what it started. 6 inches in 2 hours. Captain Aldridge would write that in his field report later, when his hands had stopped shaking enough to hold a pen. 6 inches in 2 hours, visibility near zero temperature, dropping so fast you could feel it happening in real time, pressing through your coat and your shirt and settling into the space between your ribs. The survey team had been moving through the valley below Harwick Ridge when the sky fell on them. There were 6 men in the party. Aldridge led them. He was 51 years old, built like a man who had spent his life outdoors, and looked it with a face that had been weathered past the point where age could leave much of a mark on it. He had surveyed mines across 3 territories. He had seen men make bad decisions in mountains, and he had seen mountains punish them for it. He was not by any measure a man who panicked, but he was also not stupid. Get to cover, he told his men. There is no heroism in freezing to death on a ridge when there is a mountain full of abandoned tunnels 20 yards to your left. They found the entrance to the Crescent Lady by almost walking into the boards that covered it. Old boards. Split in gray, the nails pulled half out by years of freeze and thaw, the wood so far gone that when Aldrich pushed his shoulder against the nearest plank, it gave way with almost no resistance, folding inward like it had been waiting for someone to give it permission to fall. The men pressed through into the dark. They expected nothing. An empty tunnel, cold rock, the smell of old water and dead air. They had their lanterns, and they struck them, and the light pushed maybe 15 feet ahead of them into the blackness of the shaft, and they moved forward because forward was warmer than backward. They smelled it before they saw it. Wood smoke, not old smoke, not the ghost of a fire that had burned 50 years ago in the bones of the rock. Fresh smoke, recent smoke. The smell of pine burning in a contained space, rising through something going somewhere. Aldridge stopped. The men behind him stopped. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then they kept walking. The main shaft sloped downward at a gentle angle following the old cut of the ore vein. The timber supports were ancient, but they were still standing, some of them wrapped in the kind of preservation that came from dry air and stable temperature rather than any human care. The walls were close enough to touch on both sides. The ceiling was low enough that the taller men ducked instinctively, though they had room to spare. 50 feet in the tunnel opened. The chamber was roughly 30 feet across. The ceiling arched upward to a height that surprised you, the rock above gray, black and streaked with the silver-bearing ore that had made this mine worth digging in the first place. Lanterns hung from the old timber supports at regular intervals, casting the space in warm amber light. A fire burned in a hearth built from carefully arranged flat stones, the smoke rising in a clean column toward a crack in the ceiling, somewhere above a natural chimney that someone had discovered and put to use. Against the far wall, stacked with the precision of someone who thought carefully about everything, were supplies. Dried meat wrapped in cloth, sealed jars of preserved vegetables, bags of flour, bags of beans, a barrel of something that turned out later to be salt pork, candles in bundles of a dozen, tools hung on pegs driven into the rock. A water barrel nearly full, fed by a thin pipe of hollowed wood that ran back into the rock and somewhere beyond. And in the center of it all, a young woman. She was standing very still, watching them with dark eyes that did not widen at their entrance and did not fill with the particular kind of relief that a person isolated and frightened and desperate shows when other human beings appear. She was perhaps 18 years old, or she had been 18 when she arrived here. She looked older now in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with what she had lived through. She was dressed in practical clothes, worn and patched but clean. Her hair was dark and pinned back with a practical efficiency that suggested she had no interest in how it looked, only in keeping it out of her way. Her hands were at her sides, loose and ready. She did not look like a ghost. She looked like someone who owned this place. Aldridge had seen a great many things in his years working the mountain territories of Colorado. He had surveyed mines that were haunted by the memory of the men who had died in them. He had spoken with families who had lost fathers and husbands and sons to collapses and cave-ins, and the slow grinding disaster of a vein that ran dry before the debts were paid. He had interviewed prospectors who had spent months alone in the wilderness and come out changed in ways that were difficult to name. He had never seen anything like this. "You have been living here," he said. It was not a question. The young woman looked at him for a moment with those still dark eyes. "A year," she said, "and a little more." One of the men behind Aldridge made a sound, the kind of sound that escapes from a man when his understanding of what is possible shifts beneath him like loose shale on a slope. Aldridge stepped forward into the warmth of the chamber and held his hands toward the fire. "My name is Captain Aldridge," he said. "We are a survey team, 6 men out of Denver. The storm caught us." She nodded. "There is room," she said, "in warmth. You can stay until it passes." It was not an invitation offered from loneliness the way a person who had been isolated and frightened might offer it, grasping at the first human contact like a drowning man at a rope. It was an offer made from position, from capability, from the quiet authority of someone who understood their situation completely and had chosen deliberately to extend this particular courtesy. "My name is Marin Voss," she said. "This is my home." She said it simply, without defiance, without apology, the way a man says his name when he has earned it. Aldridge looked around the chamber again. The lanterns, the fire, the organized stores, the pipe that brought water from somewhere in the rock. The smell of clean air moving through the space maintained by a ventilation system that someone had understood and worked with rather than against. He believed her. This was her home. She had made it so. What he did not know, standing in that warm chamber while the blizzard buried the world above, was the story of how she had gotten here, what it had cost her, what she had carried down into this darkness with her, and what she had found waiting at the bottom. He did not know about the pocket watch in the crevice by the far wall, or the note on the supply box, or the father who had loved his daughter enough to leave her something to find. He did not know any of it yet, but he would. They would stay 3 days, those 6 men sheltered from a storm that had no interest in human plans. And Marin Voss would tell them in the careful and measured way of someone who has spent a long time deciding which words are worth speaking, what had brought her to the bottom of an abandoned mine in the Colorado mountains. She would start at the beginning. She would start with her father. Harlan Voss had been the kind of man that a mining town needed but rarely deserved. He was not loud. He was not large. He did not drink past the point of function or gamble money he could not afford to lose, or tell stories about himself that grew with each retelling. He was of medium height, medium build, with the kind of physical competence that comes from 20 years of hard work in hard conditions. His hands were scarred and permanently dark in the creases with the particular grime of mining work that soap cannot fully reach. His face was honest, which in a mining town meant it was also somewhat unusual. He had come to Harwick, Colorado in 1858 with nothing but a strong back and the willingness to go underground. He had gone underground. He had learned the work from the inside out, the way only a man who pays close attention to everything around him can learn it, absorbing the knowledge of older miners, the way dry rock absorbs water completely and without waste. He learned to read the signs of unstable ground. He learned to follow air currents through tunnels where the candle flame could tell you more about the structure of the rock than any engineer's drawing. He learned that a mine had moods and that the difference between a man who survived and a man who did not was often nothing more than the willingness to listen to what the rock was telling you. By 1865, he was a foreman. By 1870, he was the head foreman of the Crescent Lady, the most productive silver mine in that part of Colorado, a position that paid well enough to put a family in a company house and keep them comfortable through winters that could and did kill people who were not prepared for them. He had married Margaret in 1861. She had been a school teacher, which in a mining town made her a kind of royalty. She was precise and warm in equal measure, a combination that produced in her husband and in her daughter something very like the best of what a family can be. She died in 1876 of pneumonia, in the long bad winter that hit the mountains that year, and did not let go until May. Marin was 13 when her mother died. She did not talk about it much even later, even in the journal she would keep for 60 years. Some losses do not require words. They require only time, and even then they do not diminish, so much as they relocate, moving from the foreground of a life to something carried in the background of every moment that follows. Harlan Voss grieved in the way men of his generation grieved, which is to say, silently and continuously, and without any expectation that the world would pause to accommodate him. He went back to work. He brought Marin to the mine on the days when no one could watch her, which was most days, and he let her learn. She learned everything. She learned to read a shaft the way her father read it, with her whole body, not just her eyes. She learned that sound traveled differently through different kinds of rock, and that a man with enough experience could hear the difference between stable ground and ground that was planning something. She learned that the temperature of the deep tunnels stayed constant regardless of what was happening, above a fact that struck her as almost miraculous the first time her father explained it. The mountain keeps its own warmth down there, Harlan told her, holding her hand as they walked through the lower tunnels, with his helmet lamp lighting the way ahead of them. 120 feet down, the rock is 54 degrees, summer and winter. Snow on the ground or sun overhead, it does not matter. The mountain does not notice. She was 8 years old when he told her that. She never forgot it. She learned the layout of the Crescent Lady the way she learned the layout of their house, not by thinking about it, but by moving through it until the knowledge settled into her feet and her hands and her sense of direction and became something closer to instinct than memory. She knew which passages led deeper into the mountain and which dead-ended in blank rock. She knew which chambers were large enough to stand in and which required you to bend at the waist and shuffle through sideways. She knew the deep chamber at the bottom of the main shaft, the one that stayed warm, the one where the ore in the wall still caught the light and threw it back in small silver sparks. She was happy in those tunnels. She was happy with her father. Then Cecilia came. Harlan Voss remarried in 1878, 3 years after Margaret's death, and the town approved because a man with a young daughter and a demanding job needed help, and because Cecilia Draper was presentable and well-spoken and arrived in Harwick with references from a minister in Denver and nothing in her face that suggested the particular kind of calculation happening behind it. Marin was 15 when Cecilia became Cecilia Voss, and she was not a fool. She saw what the adults around her chose not to see or chose to excuse in the way that adults excuse the behavior of people who present themselves well, because presentation has always been cheaper than character and has always, to a certain kind of observer, been difficult to distinguish from it. Cecilia was cold, not hostile, not cruel in any way that could be pointed at and named, simply cold in the specific way of a person who has made a calculation about other people and found them useful rather than interesting, valuable rather than worth loving. She was pleasant to Harlan. She managed the house with a competence that could not be criticized. She attended church and said the correct things and smiled at the correct moments. She looked at Marin the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has been placed in a room slightly wrong and that they have decided they do not have the energy to move. Not hatred, not cruelty, just absence. The particular absence of someone who has decided that a thing does not require their attention and has acted on that decision so completely that the thing has effectively ceased to exist for them. Marin understood this before she had the words for it. She understood it the way a child understands the essential nature of a person before they understand how to explain what they know. She withdrew. She spent more time at the mine and less time at home. She became her father's shadow, and her father let her because Harlan Voss was a perceptive man, and he saw the thing between his wife and his daughter, and he did what he could about it, which was to give Marin the one place in the world where she felt completely herself, the mine. In the years that followed, while Cecilia managed the house and Harlan managed the mine, and Marin moved between both worlds like a traveler who has two countries and belongs fully to only one, the Crescent Lady continued to produce silver at a rate that kept the Kellerman Mining Company satisfied and the town of Harwick employed. It was not glamorous work. It was not romantic work. It was the day-in, day-out labor of men who went underground before sunrise and came back up in the dark, and it required of its foreman not inspiration, but vigilance, not genius, but steadiness. Harlan Voss was steady. He was also watching something that worried him. In the late summer of 1881, he began noticing things in the lower tunnels that he could not account for. Small things, a support beam that showed stress marks in places where the grain of the wood should not have allowed for stress, a section of floor that had shifted slightly, settling in a way that was inconsistent with the natural compression of the surrounding rock, air currents that had changed direction in a shaft that had not been reconfigured. He took his concerns to the supervisors at Kellerman. He wrote them down carefully and presented them at the weekly meeting on September 8th, 1 week before the collapse. He said, "Something is wrong in the lower tunnels. I cannot tell you exactly what it is, but I can tell you that the mine is behaving differently than it was 6 months ago, and that this difference concerns me. The Kellerman supervisors thanked him for his diligence and told him to continue monitoring the situation. He went home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time after supper, not speaking, his coffee going cold in front of him. Marin was 18 by then, old enough to read the silence of a man she knew better than anyone alive. She sat across from him and waited. He looked up at her. "There is something wrong in the lower levels," he said. "I do not know what it is, but I want you to hear me clearly." She waited. "If anything happens to me," he said, and his voice was the careful voice of a man who has thought about what he is saying for a long time before he says it, "You go to the mine. You go to the Crescent Lady. You go down to the deep chamber. You know the one?" She knew the one. "The temperature stays constant," he said. 54 degrees. You can survive there. There are supplies in the deep chamber, a cache that was left by a man named Ezra Finch, a miner who worked this mine before me. He put them there years ago and never came back for them. They should still be good." She stared at him. He held her gaze. "If anything happens to me and Cecilia throws you out," he said, "which is what she will do because Cecilia is not a cruel woman, but she is a practical one. And you are not her daughter, and this house belongs to the company and not to us. You go to the mine. You will be safer there than anywhere else you could go." She wanted to tell him he was being foolish. She wanted to tell him that nothing was going to happen to him, that he was the steadiest man she had ever known, and that the mountain was not going to take him. She was 18 years old and she had lived her whole life in the shadow of his competence, and she was not prepared to imagine a world in which that competence was not enough. She did not say any of that. She said, "I know the chamber. I'll remember." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the dark mountains. "Good girl," he said. 7 days later, September 15th, 1881, a support beam failed in the lower tunnels of the Crescent Lady, bringing down 100 feet of rock and ore and timber and 20 years of human work. 12 men were underground when it happened. The town dug for 3 days without stopping, working in shifts, every able body in Harwick taking a turn with a shovel or a timber or the simple human labor of removing debris one piece at a time. They dug with the kind of focused desperation that keeps a person moving past the point where their body wants to stop. When they broke through to the lower level on the third day, there was no one left to save. Harlan Voss was buried with 11 other men in the rock of the mine he had spent his adult life managing. The company offered its condolences. The minister held a service. The town mourned in the particular, compressed and efficient way of a town that has mourned before and will mourn again, and has learned that grief, like everything else, must be fitted around the ongoing demands of survival. Cecilia Voss began planning. She did not wait for the funeral. This is the detail that Marin would carry with her for the rest of her life, not as a wound so much as a piece of evidence, the final and conclusive proof of the calculation that had always lived behind Cecilia's pleasant face. She did not wait for them to bury Harlan Voss before she made clear to his daughter that the terms of their relationship had changed entirely. There was no scene. Cecilia was not a dramatic woman. She was a practical one. She came to Marin's room the night of the collapse while the men were still digging, while there was still the formal fiction being maintained that there might be survivors below, and she said what she had come to say with the directness of a person who has no interest in softening a thing that she does not feel needs to be softened. "Your father is gone," she said. "The company will want the house for the new foreman within the fortnight. You have until then to make arrangements." Marin looked at her. "What arrangements?" she said. Cecilia's face showed nothing. Not grief, not guilt, not even the small discomfort of a person who is saying something they know to be hard. Just the level expression of someone completing a necessary task. "I don't know," she said. "Relatives, perhaps. Work somewhere. There are always positions available for young women willing to work. But there is no place for you here, and I think you have always understood that." "I have no relatives," Marin said. "There is no one to go to." "Then that is a difficulty you will need to solve," Cecilia said. "I am sorry. But this was always the situation." She was not sorry. The word was a courtesy, the kind of courtesy that costs nothing and conveys nothing, spoken by a person who understands its social function but has no access to its meaning. She left Marin standing in the doorway of the bedroom that had been hers for 18 years and walked back down the hall and closed her own door, and that was the end of it. Marin did not sleep that night. She did not cry either, which surprised her. She had expected grief to arrive with the news of her father's death, and it had, in its own way, a vast and silent pressure in the center of her chest that she recognized as the beginning of something that would take years to fully understand. But the grief and the shock and the loss all seemed to be operating at a remove behind a layer of something harder, something that had been activated by Cecilia's visit in a way she had not anticipated. Her father had told her what to do. He had told her 7 days ago, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, going cold, looking at her, with the eyes of a man who understood what was coming, even if he could not name it precisely. He had told her where to go. He had told her what she would find there. He had said the mountain does not notice and the temperature stays constant and there are supplies waiting. He had known, not the specifics perhaps, not the exact nature of the disaster or the precise form of Cecilia's response to it, but he had known with the intuition of a man who has spent 20 years reading the subtle signals of a mind that is thinking about doing something dangerous, that something was wrong, and that he might not have much time to give his daughter what she needed to survive without him. He had used the time he had. Marin packed a bag in the dark, early hours of September 16th, while Cecilia slept, and the town outside was quiet with the exhausted quiet of people who have worked without stopping for 36 hours and have finally allowed themselves to rest. She did not take much. She took clothes, and she took the small amount of money her father had kept in the box at the back of his desk. Not enough to matter, but something. And she took the compass. Her mother had owned a small brass thing that caught the lamplight and held it. She did not take anything that was not hers. She left the house without a sound. The night was cold and the sky was black, and the mountains were dark shapes against the dark above them. And the town was silent, and she walked through it without looking at the houses she had known all her life, the saloon and the assay office, and the church where her mother's funeral had been held, and her father's would be held in a few days without her. She walked through the town and up the switchback trail that she had walked 100 times with her father on early mornings when he was going to work, and she was going to stand in the lamplight of the mine and watch him organize the day. She walked until the lights of Harwick were aglow behind her, and then a suggestion, and then nothing. The trail to the Crescent Lady was not long. 3 miles, maybe a little more, switchbacking up the side of the ridge in the way that mining roads do, following the path of least resistance through terrain that had no interest in making things easy. She had walked it in all weather. She had walked it in snow. She knew every turn and every loose stone and every place where the trail narrowed to less than a body's width, with a drop on one side that you learned to respect and then learned to stop thinking about. She walked it now, in the dark, by feel and memory, and the mine entrance came up before her out of the night. The boards across the entrance were old and weathered and half-rotted, the nails drawn out by years of freeze and thaw cycles, the wood gray and splitting. They gave way when she pulled at them with both hands, first one plank and then another, creating an opening just wide enough to move through sideways. She stepped into the mountain. The darkness inside the Crescent Lady was different from the darkness outside. Outside, there was the darkness of a sky without moon, the soft ambient black of a night in the mountains. There was starlight, or the possibility of starlight, and the ambient glow of a world that reflected whatever light existed back at itself in 1,000 subtle ways. There was depth to it and distance in the suggestion of space. Inside the mind, the darkness was absolute, not the absence of light, but the presence of nothing. A darkness so complete that it pressed against your eyes like a physical thing, making them work harder, and find less a darkness in which the distinction between looking and not looking ceased to have meaning. She had been in this darkness before as a child, when her father's lamp went out accidentally in a lower tunnel, and he held her hand and talked to her in a calm and steady voice while he worked the flint striker to relight it. She had understood it then intellectually. She understood it differently now. She had candles in her bag. She had a box of matches. She had her father's description of the layout of the mine carried in her body, not in her mind the way directions become when you have traveled them often enough. She lit a candle. The flame was small, but after the absolute dark of the unlit shaft, it seemed bright as anything she had ever seen. She held it up and moved forward. She went down. The main shaft sloped in the same long, gentle angle she remembered from childhood, the same timber supports at regular intervals, the same walls close on both sides. The air changed as she went deeper, becoming still and slightly warmer, losing the cold edge that came from the surface. Her footsteps were careful and deliberate. She tested the ground before each step the way her father had taught her, learning the floor before trusting it with her weight. At the junction where the main shaft divided, she went left deeper, following the primary ore vein, the one her father had followed when the mine was working, the one that had taken the shafts down to the deepest workings. She went past the first level where the offices had been, where the blasting powder was stored, where the foreman's station was set up with its maps and its records. She went past the second level where the richest ore had run, where 12 men had spent 10 years carving the mountain's wealth out of the rock 1 foot at a time. She went past the third level where the vein had narrowed and the returns had diminished, where the decision had been made by men in Denver who had never been underground that the mine was no longer economically viable. She went to the fourth level, 120 feet below the surface, and she felt it before she saw anything. The warmth. It came up from the floor and out from the walls, the constant deep warmth of the earth below, all weather and all season, the temperature that had nothing to do with what was happening above and everything to do with what the earth kept inside itself. 54 degrees. Not warm by the standard of a heated room, but warm in the way that matters when the alternative is the cold of a Colorado September night with no shelter and no fire. The chamber opened around her candle flame. It was large, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough to stand in. The walls were ore-bearing rock, silver-streaked, catching the candlelight and throwing it back in small cold sparks. The floor was level, worn smooth by years of foot traffic by the men who had worked down here during the years the mine was running. There were the remains of equipment, a rusted ore cart on its side, a pile of timber that had been staged for use and never used. The air moved faintly, drawn by some ventilation system that still functioned after years of abandonment, the mountain breathing in its slow and patient way. And in the far corner, stacked against the wall with a care and deliberateness that immediately set it apart from the abandoned debris of the mining operation, was a cache. Boxes of sealed provisions, cans of food, bags of dried goods, blankets folded in oilcloth, candles in bundles, tools, good ones, a hatchet and a folding saw, and a knife with a bone handle. And on top of the uppermost box, held in place by a single stone, a folded piece of paper faded with time, the ink gone brown but still legible. She took the paper off the box and held her candle close and read it. To whoever finds this, you have earned the right to be here. Use it well. She read it twice. Then she stood in the warm chamber at the bottom of the mountain her father had managed for 20 years, in the place where he had told her to come, holding a note written by a man she had never met, to a person he had never imagined. And she felt for the first time since Cecilia had walked into her bedroom, with her practical face and her practical words, something other than the weight of loss. She felt welcomed, not by a person, not by the world which had made its position on the question of Maren Voss abundantly clear. Welcomed by something larger than that, by the fact of the cache itself, the fact that a man she did not know had left this here for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and that it had found her anyway. That the mountain had held it. That her father had known it was here. That the whole improbable chain of human care and practical foresight had ended precisely here. She sat down on the cold floor, and she held the note, and she let the warmth of the earth rise up around her, and she breathed. Then she got up and started taking inventory. She worked through the night, which was the same as working through the day, because there was no distinction between them at 120 feet. She opened each box carefully and examined what it contained and arranged it against the wall in the order of its likely usefulness. The food was old but sealed well and showed no signs of spoilage. The dried goods, flour and beans and salt, were intact in their oilcloth wrappings. The candles were good. The tools were solid under the rust on their surfaces. The man who had left this had not left it carelessly. Every item had been chosen with purpose, packed with thought, sealed against time. He had imagined the person who would find this, whoever they might be, and he had tried to give them what they would need. She found the pocket watch in the second hour. She was moving along the far wall of the chamber, running her hand along the rock at chest height, the way her father had taught her to check for fissures when her fingers found a gap in the stone. A natural crevice, roughly vertical, 3 inches wide at its widest, narrowing to nothing at both ends. Inside it, wedged deliberately, not fallen, deliberately placed, she felt metal. She worked it free carefully, her fingers cold against the stone. She held her candle close. It was a pocket watch. Silver case, not valuable by the standards of a city, But good quality work, the kind of watch a man bought when he had earned enough to spend a little on something that would last. The case was worn smooth with years of handling, the silver gone dull, the chain broken off at the ring. She turned it over. On the back, engraved in the careful script of a watchmaker who had been told to do the job right, H. Voss. She went very still. This was her father's watch. She knew it with the certainty of a person recognizing something they have seen 1,000 times, the watch he had carried every day of his working life, the watch she had seen him pull from his vest pocket to check the time before shift began, the watch she had heard ticking in the quiet of early mornings when he sat at the table with his coffee and she ran across from him. The watch that was supposed to be on his body in the rock, 100 feet from where she stood, in the section of the lower tunnel where 12 men had been buried when the ground came down. She opened the case. The watch had been wound. Recently wound, the mainspring still holding tension, the mechanism still turning. She held it close to her ear, and in the silence of the deep chamber, with the mountain around her and the warmth rising up from below, and the absolute stillness of a place that had been quiet for years, she heard it, ticking. Harlan Voss had survived the initial collapse. Not long enough to be saved, not long enough for the men digging above to reach him, but long enough to make his way somehow through whatever tunnels had remained passable in the chaos of the failing mine down to the deep chamber. Long enough to reach the place he had told his daughter to come to. Long enough to put his watch in the crevice in the wall where she would find it if she ran her hand along the rock the way he had taught her. Long enough to wind it. He had known she would come. He had done the one thing that remained within his power. He had left her something to find. He had left her the proof that he had thought of her at the end, that she had been the last thing he had done something about that in the final hours of Harlan Voss's life in the mountain, that had been his life's work. His daughter had been the thing he had not let go of. Marin sat down on the floor of the deep chamber with her father's watch in both hands, the ticking small and steady in the silence, and she did not cry. She had no explanation for why she did not cry. The grief was there, enormous and real, pressing against everything inside her chest. But the grief shared space with something else now, something that felt like it was being constructed in real time from the materials at hand, from the note on the supply box, and the warmth in the rock, and the watch that was still running because her father had taken the time to wind it. She sat in the warmth at the bottom of the mountain. She wound the watch again, though it did not need it yet, feeling the small resistance of the crown under her fingers, the mechanism clicking faintly as the spring took the tension. The ticking continued in the dark. She listened to it for a long time. Then she got up and she began the work of making this place a home. The first thing she learned was that time was different underground. Above the surface, time moved with the visible machinery of the world. The sun rose and set, light changed, temperature shifted. The behavior of animals and the color of the sky and the sound of wind through pine trees all conspired to keep a person oriented in the river of hours and days, to make them feel the passage of time as a physical experience rather than an abstraction. Above the surface, you could not lose track of time without working at it. Below, at 120 feet, time became something else entirely. It became internal. It became the hunger in your stomach and the heaviness behind your eyes and the ache in your hands from the work you had done before you allowed yourself to rest. It became the candles marked in careful sections with a thumbnail so she could measure how many hours had burned, each notch, a kind of clock face, each stub, a record of time spent in the dark. It became the watch her father's watch wound every morning without fail, its ticking the one sound in the deep chamber that bore any relationship to the world of measured hours that existed above. She kept herself on a schedule. This was the first decision she made, deliberate and considered, in the early days of living in the Crescent Lady's deep chamber. Not because she needed a schedule to survive, but because she understood with the intuition of someone who had been paying close attention to things all her life that the absence of structure was not freedom, but dissolution. That a person who allowed the formless dark to set the terms of her days would eventually find the days becoming formless too, and then the person inside them. She rose when the watch told her it was morning. She ate a measured portion of whatever she had prepared. She worked for 6 hours. She allowed herself 1 hour of rest. She worked for 4 more hours. She ate again. She reviewed what she had done and what remained to be done. She slept. It sounds mechanical described that way. It was not. It was the opposite of mechanical. It was the kind of discipline that practiced long enough, stops feeling like discipline, and begins to feel like the natural shape of a life, the structure beneath the surface of things that allows everything else to grow. She expanded the cache first. The supplies Ezra Finch had left were sufficient for survival, but not indefinite survival. She calculated this in the first week, working through the quantities with the methodical precision her father had modeled for her in the 20 years of watching a man manage a mine, which is to say managing the relationship between what you have and what you need in the space of time that exists between them. She had enough preserved food for perhaps 6 months if she was careful. Careful was not the goal. Careful was the floor. She went to the surface on the third day in the early hours before dawn, when the darkness above matched the darkness below, and the trail to the mine entrance was unlikely to carry any other travelers. She moved quickly and quietly, gathering pine nuts from the cones she found under the trees, at the edge of the timberline, digging wild onions from the soft ground near the creek, cutting armfuls of dry grass that she would need later for insulation and bedding. She was back underground before the sky began to lighten. This became the pattern of her surface excursions. Early hours, quiet movement, specific purpose. She did not go to town. She did not go anywhere that might put her in contact with people, with the world that had closed its door on her, with Cecilia's practical face and the particular silence of a community that knows a girl has no one and does nothing about it. She was not ready for that world, and she was not sure she ever would be. What she was ready for was the work, and the work was vast. She taught herself to trap in the first weeks of autumn while the surface was still passable and the small animals of the mountain were still active. She had watched her father describe the principles of it once years ago, a conversation that had been in passing rather than instruction, but she had the kind of memory that stores passing conversations against future need. She constructed simple snares from wire she found in the abandoned equipment stores on the upper levels of the mine, tested them lost animals through failures in the design, adjusted, improved, tested again. By October, she was reliably catching rabbits and occasionally something larger. She learned to skin and dress the catches efficiently, to dry the meat in thin strips over the small fire she had built in the chamber hearth, to render the fat into candles that burned cleaner than the commercial ones Finch had left. Nothing was wasted. This became a principle she was not conscious of choosing. It was simply the logic of her situation made material. The bones became stock. The hides became bedding and eventually clothing. The sinew became cordage for repairs and improvements. Every piece of every animal that came through her hands contributed something, and she found after a while that this thoroughness was not deprivation, but a different kind of richness. The richness of understanding the full value of a thing because you have used all of it. She improved the chamber throughout that first autumn with a systematic focus that she found clarifying. She built a proper hearth from flat stones she carried down from the second level, one stone at a time over several trips, and she designed it with the understanding she had absorbed from years of watching her father think about ventilation and airflow in underground spaces. The smoke had to go somewhere. The Crescent Lady had a natural vent in the rock above the deep chamber, a fissure that ran up toward the surface following some ancient fracture in the stone. Her father had shown it to her once, held his hand flat above a certain point on the floor, and let her feel the faint pull of air moving upward. She built the hearth directly below that fissure, and the smoke rose through it and disappeared into the mountain's own circulation, and the chamber filled with warmth instead of choking. She built a bed from mine timbers, lashing them with cordage at the joints, topping them with the dried grass she had gathered and the hides she had tanned in the way she had worked out through trial and significant error. She made shelves from scrap timber. She organized the food stores with the logic of a woman who understood that a long winter required that you know exactly what you have and exactly where it is. She mapped the mine. This was something she began almost by accident in the early weeks when she was exploring the upper levels for salvageable materials and found herself uncertain about a passage she had been certain she knew. She went back to the chamber and she picked up a flat piece of shale and a sharp edge of iron ore, and she began to draw. She drew from memory, corrected from observation, tested by walking and walking again, until the map in her hand matched the mine in her body. She went deeper than she had gone as a child, deeper than her father had taken her into passages that were not on any official survey of the mine that existed, because the mountain had them, and not because any engineer had planned them. She mapped those too. She moved through tunnels so narrow she had to turn sideways and breathe carefully, following the faint pull of moving air that told her the passage was connected to something rather than sealed at the far end. She found chambers that had been worked and abandoned without being recorded in the mine's official documents, places where a vein had been followed and then lost, and the passage left as a dead end in the record books, while the actual tunnel continued another 50 feet before it genuinely stopped. She found a spring in the third month. Not immediately. She heard at first a change in the quality of the silence. In a lower passage, she had been mapping a faint difference in the sound of her own footsteps that suggested wet stone somewhere ahead. She followed the sound over 3 separate visits, moving in darkness with her hand on the wall, until she found the crack in the rock face from which water moved in a constant, slow seep, boned and clean, pooling in a shallow depression in the floor, before disappearing into a lower fissure. She tasted it. She waited 2 days and tasted it again. She brought a iron and took a sample to the light of her chamber and looked at it clear and odorless, with none of the iron taint that sometimes made underground water undrinkable. She built a collection system over the following 2 weeks, a channel of split wood that she caulked with pine pitch and positioned to catch the seep and direct it into a barrel she had carried down from the upper levels in pieces and reassembled. When the barrel was full, she had more clean water than she could drink in a month. The spring filled it again in a week. She did not have to go to the surface for water after that. The first winter hit the mountains in November hard and without much preamble. She had felt it coming before she saw it, the way the air moving through the mine shafts changed its character, losing the residual warmth it carried down from the autumn surface and taking on instead the dry, hard cold of a Colorado high country winter, settling in for its long stay. She had been preparing since September. She was as prepared as she could make herself, which she understood was not the same as being prepared enough. The food stores were solid. The water was reliable. The chamber was as warm as she could make it without using more fuel than she had available. She had accumulated a winter's worth of candles carefully rationed. She had clothing made from hides that would keep her functional at the temperature she expected. What she had not prepared for was the silence. Not the silence of the mind which she had learned and which she understood, and which had its own subtle vocabulary of small sounds and air movements, in the deep occasional groan of rock under its own weight. Not that silence which was familiar, now almost companionable. The other silence, the silence of a human life without any other human being in it. She had been alone before in the way that all people are alone, sometimes in rooms and in moments. She had never been alone the way she was alone now, which was completely without mitigation, without the possibility of accidental contact with another person, without the ambient awareness of other lives being lived nearby that cushions even the most solitary existence in the ordinary world. She was 120 feet underground in an abandoned mine in the Colorado mountains in the winter, and there was no one within miles who knew she was there or would have done anything about it if they had. Some days she forgot what her own voice sounded like. She discovered this one evening in early December, sitting by the fire with her map spread on her knee, when she tried to say something aloud, just a word, the name of what she was working on, or the thought she was completing, and the sound that came out was strange to her, rusty, uncertain at its edges, as if the mechanism that produced it had been left unused long enough to need warming up. After that, she talked to herself deliberately and every day. She described what she was doing as she did it, narrating her work in the dry and factual tone of a man explaining a procedure to an apprentice. She talked to her father. She knew he could not hear her. She talked to him anyway in the way she had talked to him when he was alive, telling him about problems she was working through, asking his opinion on approaches she was uncertain about, arguing with the response she imagined him giving when she thought his imagined response was wrong. Some nights she simply talked to the mountain. She was not sure this was different from talking to her father. The loneliness of that first winter was the hardest thing she had ever experienced, and she had experienced the death of her mother at 13 and the death of her father at 18, and the specific cruelty of Cecilia's cold practicality. Those things had weight. They had cost her something real and lasting. But this was different. Those losses had happened to her while she was surrounded by a world that continued, however indifferently, to exist and to offer the consolation of its existence. This was the withdrawal of the world itself, the removal of context and companionship and the simple animal comfort of other human beings, and it pressed on her in a way that she had not anticipated. She did not break. She is at pains in her journals to not make this sound simpler than it was. She writes about the nights when the darkness pressed too close, and the warmth of the fire seemed insufficient against the cold weight of absolute solitude. She writes about the mornings when she had to argue herself into the schedule, into the structure that she knew was keeping her functional, because the weight of isolation had made the simplest acts feel pointless. She writes about the conversation with herself that happened in January, sitting in the deep chamber with the watch in her hands, in which she laid out the options clearly and chose with deliberate and conscious intent to continue. She chose to continue because she had been given something to continue with: the watch, the cash, the note on the supply box, the mine itself mapped now in her own hand, known to her in her body and her feet and the palms of her hands, the knowledge her father had given her, and the knowledge she had accumulated in the months since she came underground. She had been given tools. She understood, sitting in that January firelight, that the tools were not the point. The use of them was the point. The person being made by the use of them was the point. She got up and went back to work. Spring came late to the high country that year, the snow holding in the passes until June, the trails running with snowmelt that made them impassable long after the calendar suggested otherwise. When she could finally move on the surface again, she did so with a different kind of physical ease than she had carried down into the mine the previous September. The months of underground work, carrying timber and stone and water, of moving through confined spaces that required a continuous physical awareness and precision, had built something in her body that had not been there before. Not just strength, though she was stronger. Something more like capability. A body that understood what it was being asked to do and had been trained by necessity into a reliable instrument. She gathered through the summer months with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything underground. She ranged further from the mine entrance as the season allowed, mapping the surface the way she had mapped the tunnels below, building a knowledge of the terrain that was precise and practical and oriented always toward the question of what it could provide. She found stands of pine nut trees she had not known before. She found a seep on the north slope of the ridge that produced a plant she recognized as useful for preventing the kind of tooth and gum decay that afflicted miners who went too long without fresh food. She found in a meadow below the timberline a colony of wild onions so dense and productive that she spent an entire day harvesting and processing them for winter stores. She did not go to town. She came close enough once to stand at the edge of the timber and look down at the streets of Harwick in the late afternoon light, the familiar shape of buildings she had known all her life, the movement of people, small with distance. She watched for a while. Then she went back into the mountain. She was not ready. She was not sure what ready would feel like. She was not sure she was looking for it. The second autumn was easier than the first in all the ways that matter, and harder in one way she had not expected. It was easier because she knew what winter required now, not theoretically but in her body, and she moved through the preparation for it with a competence that was qualitatively different from the previous year's anxious and uncertain scramble. She had enough food before October. She had the spring water. She had improved the ventilation of the chamber, enough to run a slightly larger fire with the same fuel, which meant more warmth with no greater cost to her supplies. The way it was harder was this: she had grown accustomed to what the mine required of her, and the mine had stopped requiring the things that had kept her from thinking too clearly about what she was. In the first months, survival had consumed her attention so completely that there had been no room for the other kinds of thought. The logistics of staying alive are demanding enough when you are starting from nothing in an abandoned mine to occupy the whole of a person's cognitive capacity and leave nothing left over for reflection. This is perhaps their mercy. She had been busy enough to be in some ways simply present, simply doing the next thing and the next, without the space to step back from the situation and look at it. By the second autumn, she had space. She used it. She sat by the fire in the long evenings with her journals and her maps, and she thought about what she was doing here and what it meant and what she intended to happen next, and she found that she did not have clear answers to any of these questions. She had survival. She had the mind mapped and understood and managed as well as a person working alone could manage it. She had the watch and the note and the sense of continuity with her father, that the mine itself provided the walls of ore he had spent his life extracting the shafts he had managed the air that had moved through these tunnels for 20 years while he walked through them with his lamp and his knowledge. She had something she had not had on the night she packed her bag and left Cecilia's house. She had a life that no one could take from her. This was the thing she turned over and over in the firelight of the second autumn, examining it from different angles. The way she examined a section of ore-bearing rock, looking for what it was made of and what it meant. She had built something. Not the chamber, not the cache, not the mapped tunnels, not the water system. Those were materials. What she had built was less visible and more fundamental. She had built a version of herself that existed independently of anyone else's assessment of her value. That had been constructed entirely from her own choices and her own work and her own willingness to continue when continuation was the harder option. Cecilia had looked at her and seen a piece of furniture to be moved. The mountain had looked at her with its patient and indifferent regard and offered neither kindness nor cruelty, only conditions. She had met the conditions. She had built a life in the place the world had forgotten to look. She was 18 years old when she came into the Crescent Lady. She was not entirely sure, sitting by the fire in the second autumn, what age she was now. 20 or close to it. 20 years old and the most competent person in any room she might walk into if she were to walk into a room which she had not done in more than a year. She found she was thinking about that, not with the longing of loneliness, not with the desperation of isolation. Thinking about it the way a person thinks about a road they know exists but have not yet decided to take. They came in October. The storm hit the mountains on the second day of the month, the kind of early season blizzard that caught experienced mountain travelers wrong-footed, because it arrived 2 weeks before the calendar, expected it moving fast off the peaks, with 6 inches of snow in 2 hours, and visibility gone to nothing within the first hour of the fall. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of boots on the tunnel floor above, hesitant moving by feel in the dark, the sound of men in an unfamiliar space trying to find their way. She turned up her lanterns. She stood in the center of the chamber and waited because she had heard them coming and had decided in the 30 seconds available to her how she intended to receive them. Not with fear, not with the wild relief of a person rescued from something she had not chosen, with the composure of a person in her own home, in a space she understood completely, and they did not at all. They came around the final curve in the shaft, 6 of them, their lanterns lit and held up high, and their faces showing the particular expression of men who have prepared themselves for an empty tunnel and have found instead something they cannot immediately explain. The one in front was older than the others, with the weathered face of a man who had spent his working life outdoors and the particular composure of someone who had learned through experience to adjust quickly to the unexpected. He stopped when he saw her. The men behind him stopped. He held his lantern up. She did not move. He took in the chamber slowly, the lanterns hanging from the timber, supports the fire in the hearth, the organized stores, the water system, the bed, the tools, the maps pinned flat on a section of wooden planking she had salvaged and fixed to the wall. He took it all in with the careful and thorough attention of a professional, a man whose work required him to look at a space and understand it quickly. Then he looked at her. "You have been living here," he said. "A year," she said, and a little more. She watched something shift behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recalibration. The rapid revision of assumptions. "My name is Captain Aldridge," he said. "We are a survey team out of Denver." "The storm caught us," she held his gaze. "There is room," she said, "and warmth. You can stay until it passes." He looked around the chamber once more. Not the look of a man assessing whether to accept an offer. The look of a man understanding for the first time the full nature of what he was looking at. "My name is Marin Voss," she said. She let the name settle. Let them hear it plainly and without apology. The name of a girl this town had thrown away, standing in a home she had made out of nothing, in a place none of them could have survived in for a week. "This is my home," she said. They stayed 3 days. 3 days of the storm above and the warmth below of 6 men filling a space that had been built for one and finding it adequate because it had been built with more thoroughness than any of them had encountered in a long time. They ate her food and used her light and slept in the chamber with the fire burning low through the night. In the mornings they were careful to be useful to carry water, and to manage the fire with the competence of men who understood that the person who had made this place had standards for its operation and that those standards would be maintained. She talked to them in the evenings by the fire, answering questions with the economy of someone who has learned that words are tools and tools should be used with precision. Aldridge asked most of the questions. He wanted to know about the layout of the mine, which passages were stable and which were not, where the old workings were, and how the ventilation system functioned, how she had found the water source and built the collection system. He asked as a professional, one person who understood underground environments, speaking to another, not with the patronizing curiosity of someone amazed that a young woman had managed to survive, with the direct engagement of someone who recognized expertise and wanted to understand it. She answered as a professional. She went to the map on the wall and she walked him through it, showing him the documented passages and the undocumented ones, the stable sections and the sections that required care, the water system and the ventilation and the places where the rock told you something if you knew how to listen for it. He was quiet for a long time when she was done. "Miss Voss," he said, "there is a position open with my company. Someone who knows these mines the way you know this one would be more valuable than I can adequately express at this particular moment." She looked at him. "The world up there threw me away," she said. She said it without self-pity, as a statement of fact accurately describing a thing that had happened. He met her eyes. "The world up there made a significant error," he said. "That does not mean it is without the capacity to correct it." She was not ready to answer that. She knew she was not ready to answer it, and she did not pretend otherwise. He nodded as if she had said something rather than nothing, and let it go. On the third day, when the storm had broken and the sky above was the hard bright blue that comes after a heavy Colorado fall snow, he pulled on his coat and looked at her one last time before leading his men back up the shaft toward the surface. "You know where to find us," he said. She did. She stood in the chamber after they were gone and listened to the mine return to itself, to its own sounds and rhythms, the drip of water and the faint movement of air, and the deep, occasional settling of rock that she had learned to hear as conversation rather than threat. She was alone again. The aloneness was the same as it had been before they came, and different in a way she sat with for a long time. She was thinking about Aldridge's offer in the first week of December when Ezra Finch walked into her mine. She heard him from 50 feet, the slow, uneven footsteps of a man who was not moving by choice but by what remained of his will, a shuffle and a stop and a shuffle again, each movement a decision separately made. She was up the shaft and around the final bend in the upper passage with her lantern held high before she had fully thought about moving. He was collapsed against the tunnel wall 30 feet from the entrance. An old man, 82 years old, though she would not know that for another hour, white-haired and white-bearded, his face gone to the dangerous gray of a man whose body temperature has dropped below the point of clear thinking. His clothing was good, but insufficient for what the weather had done to him. His boots were worn through in places. He had one hand pressed flat against the wall, the way a person presses against a wall when the wall is the only thing still keeping them vertical. He looked up at her lantern. "Found it?" He said, his voice barely above a whisper and cracked with cold. "Took long enough." She got his arm across her shoulders and her arm around his waist, and she walked him down. He was heavier than he looked, which was itself not light, and his feet were not cooperative. But she had been carrying mine timbers and ore cart components in barrels of water for 14 months, and she was not the same person who had come down this shaft with a bag of clothes and a compass. She got him to the chamber and got him next to the fire and got his wet outer clothing off and got blankets around him and got water heated and into him, all of it done in the brisk and efficient way of someone who understands what cold does to a body and has the tools to address it. He was coherent within the hour. He looked around the chamber with eyes that were sharp despite everything his body had been through, the eyes of a man who was accustomed to assessing underground spaces and still did it automatically by reflex, even when he had just been carried in from near death by a young woman he had never met. "You used my supplies," he said. She was sitting across the fire from him, watching his color improve in the warmth. "Yes," she said. "Good." He shifted the blanket higher on his shoulders. "That's what they were for." He looked at her. His eyes were dark and clear, the eyes of a man who had spent a long life looking at things directly. "My name is Ezra Finch," he said. She had been waiting for him to say that. Not him specifically, Not this man on this particular December evening. But some version of this conversation ever since she had read his note and used his supplies and understood that the person who had left them was the kind of person who would eventually want to know what had happened to them. Marin Voss, she said. He was quiet for a moment. His gaze moved around the chamber again, cataloging, noting each improvement and modification from whatever version of it he carried in his memory. The hearth, the water system, the organized stores, the maps on the wall. He took it all in with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who is in no danger of running out of time because all the time he has left is right here. Then his gaze stopped. It stopped on the shelf beside her bed, on the particular spot where she kept the watch wound each morning, placed each night with the same care her father had placed it in the crevice for her to find. He was looking at the watch with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite surprise, something older than both. She reached over and picked it up and held it out to him. He took it in hands that were still shaking slightly with residual cold. He turned it over. He read the engraving on the back. He was quiet for a very long time. Harlan Voss, he said. His voice had changed. Something in it had changed. She waited. He looked up from the watch to her face. In the firelight, his eyes were the eyes of a man holding something he thought he had lost the right to. I taught that man to read a mind, Finch said. 25 years ago, when he was just a young man starting out first real job, didn't know the difference between a fissure and a fault. He watched everything, remembered everything. He learned faster than anyone I worked with before or since. She heard it completely. She heard every part of it. He taught me, she said. Finch looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the chamber around them, the life built from his cash, and her father's knowledge, and her own 2 years of work and attention. He looked back at her. Then I suppose he said slowly something in his voice like a man doing arithmetic and arriving at a number he had not expected that the mind went where it needed to go. He set the watch carefully on his knee, face up, and they sat together in the warm chamber with the fire between them, while the December wind worked at the mountain above and found no purchase, and the watch ticked in the silence, steady and patient, keeping time the way it had always kept time. The mountain held them. Outside, the winter settled in. The passes closed. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that makes the air hurt to breathe and turns the pines into black shapes against a white skyline. But in the deep chamber of the Crescent Lady at 120 feet, the temperature held where it always held, 54 degrees. The mountain did not notice the cold above it, and Marin Voss sat across the fire from the man who had taught her father's watch between them, and felt the chain of it, the full length of it, Finch to her father to her. The knowledge passing hand to hand through decades, the mind, at the center of it all, patient and warm and indifferent to the drama of human lives, except insofar as those lives chose to learn from it. She had come here with nothing. She had been given this. Finch pulled out a pipe from somewhere in the layers of his blankets and looked at her questioningly. She gestured at the hearth. He lit the pipe with a twig from the fire and settled back, and the smell of tobacco joined the smell of wood smoke and the smell of stone and the faint mineral smell of the ore in the walls. "You found the spring," he said, looking at the water barrel. "I heard it before I found it," she said. The sound changed in the lower passage. He nodded slowly as if she had answered correctly. "Your father would have heard it too," he said. "That's the kind of thing he would have noticed." She looked at the fire. "Yes," she said, "I know." Ezra Finch stayed through December. He had not planned to stay that long. He had come 200 miles to see the person who had found his cash, to satisfy the particular curiosity of an old man who had spent his life underground and understood what it meant that someone had found those supplies and used them and lived. He had expected to stay a day, perhaps 2. He had expected to find a girl who needed something from him, rescue or guidance or the consolation of another human voice. He found instead a woman who needed nothing from him, and this interested him far more than the alternative would have. He stayed because the December weather in the Colorado high country does not consult the travel plans of 82-year-old men. He stayed because the walk-in had taken the last of something in him, some reserve of physical capacity that had not been fully accounted for when he made the decision to come, and that revealed its absence only after he arrived and the warmth of the chamber settled into his bones and his body admitted what it had been refusing to admit since Durango. He stayed because Marin Voss did not make him feel like a burden, which was the thing he had feared most about being old and frail in a place that required strength, and which she accomplished not through false reassurance, but through the simple act of treating his presence as a normal feature of the situation rather than a complication to be managed. They developed a routine. She worked and he watched and occasionally offered the opinion of a man who had spent 40 years in mines like this one and had opinions worth offering. She did not always take his suggestions, and when she did not, she had reasons, and the reasons were usually sound, and he found he respected this more than he would have respected automatic deference. She brought him his meals and kept the fire at the level his old bones required, and did these things without comment or fanfare, the way a competent person does the necessary things cleanly and without making an event of them. In the evenings they talked, not about small things. Neither of them had much interest in small things. They talked about mines, about the ones Finch had worked across 4 decades, and the things each had taught him, about what the Crescent Lady had been in its productive years and what it was now, and what the relationship was between those two versions of the same hole in the mountain. They talked about her father, which was what they had in common, beyond the mine and the cash, the man who connected them across 25 years, and the particular tragedy of his death. Finch talked about Harlan Voss with the careful respect of a man describing someone he had genuinely admired, which in Finch's vocabulary was a rarer thing than it might have been in a man of lesser standards. He described the young Harlan, first year underground, watching everything and asking the right questions in the right way, the questions of a man who was listening to the answers rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He described watching Harlan develop the particular intuition for underground environments that could not be taught but could only be grown through years of paying attention, the sense of a mind as something with its own language and its own moods that required not conquest but conversation. He was the best I worked with, Finch said one evening without preamble, without build-up, simply as a statement of fact that had been sitting with him long enough to require speaking. In 40 years, the best. Marin was quiet for a moment. He taught me everything he knew, she said. Finch looked at the maps on her wall, at the water system, at the hearth she had built, and the ventilation she had designed, and the organized stores that represented 14 months of methodical accumulation. I can see that, he said. He asked her the question on the 20th of December, sitting by the fire with his pipe and the cup of tea she had prepared from dried plants she had gathered the previous summer on the south slope of the ridge. He asked it without leading into it, without the particular human habit of softening a direct question with surrounding conversation, which was a habit he had shed somewhere in his 7th decade as unnecessary and faintly dishonest. Did you find yourself here, he said, or did you lose yourself? She looked at him across the fire. She understood the question. She had been thinking about a version of it since October, since the survey team had come and gone and left the space they vacated, feeling different from the space they had entered, charged with the awareness of what existed above the surface and what it might mean to return to it. She had been sitting with it. She had not been ready to answer it. She was not sure she was ready now. I do not know yet, she said. He nodded as if this were the correct answer, as if only fools know things for certain. She thought about it for 3 weeks. Not passively, not in the way a person sets a question aside and hopes the answer will arrange itself while they are occupied with other things. She thought about it the way she approached every problem the mind had presented her, which was directly and with the full weight of her attention, examining it from multiple angles, testing the conclusions she reached, and finding their weaknesses and testing them again. She thought about who she had been in September of 1881, standing on the porch of the company house with a bag of clothes and no future. A girl who had never made a significant decision alone. A girl whose competence had been real but untested, known to her father and to herself and to no one else, existing in the private space of underground tunnels and early morning conversations with a man who believed in her. A girl who had been thrown away by a world that had not bothered to look closely enough to understand what it was discarding. She thought about who she was now. The answer to that question was not difficult. She had evidence. She had the mind mapped in her own hand, understood in her body. She had the water system and the hearth and the stores and the trapping lines on the surface. She had 14 months of decisions made alone in the dark, each one tested by the unforgiving logic of survival, which does not reward self-deception and does not accept excuses and does not care whether you are 18 years old and frightened and newly bereaved. She had the competence she had built here, which was not the potential competence her father had seen in her, but the demonstrated, proven, repeatedly tested competence of a person who had been given the hardest possible examination and had passed it. She was not the girl who had come down this shaft in September of 1881. But the question Finch had asked was not about competence. She understood this in the second week sitting in the deep chamber in the early hours when Finch was asleep, and the fire had burned to coals, and the mine was at its most quiet, the particular stillness that came in the coldest part of the night, when even the rock seemed to be holding its breath. She understood that competence was not the thing Finch was asking about. He could see the competence. It was written on every wall of the chamber. He was asking about something harder. He was asking whether she had disappeared into this place, whether the 18 months of darkness and solitude and the intense inward focus of survival had cost her the thing that makes survival worth the effort, the connection to the world of human beings, to the complicated and unreliable, and sometimes cruel but also sometimes extraordinary fact of other people. He was asking whether the mine had saved her or consumed her, whether what remained was a person who had found herself or a person who had lost herself so thoroughly that she no longer noticed the absence. She sat with this question in the cold hours, and she was honest with herself in the way that the mine had trained her to be honest, which was completely and without the small, merciful evasions that ordinary life permits. And she found the answer in the wrong place. She found it not in what the mine had given her, but in what she had refused to give up. In the journal she had kept not as a survival tool, but as a record of a consciousness that was still engaged with ideas and questions and the ongoing project of understanding her situation and herself. In the way she had talked to Aldridge and his men, not with the desperate overflow of isolation, but with the precision and composure of a person who had things to say and had been thinking carefully about how to say them. In the fact that when Finch arrived half dead in her tunnel, her first response had been not calculation, but care. She had gotten him down and gotten him warm and gotten water into him without stopping to consider what it would cost her, because some things do not require consideration. She had not disappeared. She had been distilled. Everything that had been peripheral, everything that had been the noise of a life lived in the presence of other people's opinions and other people's definitions and other people's assessments of what she was worth, had been stripped away by the months underground. What remained was not diminished. It was essential. It was the person she actually was without the layers that ordinary social life imposes on a person before they have had the time to discover what lies beneath them. She had found herself, but she found sitting in the cold dark with this answer finally arrived at something else, something she had not expected. She had stayed here this long, not because she was afraid of the surface. She had stayed because this was the first place in her life, the first time since her father had been alive and walking these tunnels with her, that she had possessed something that could not be taken from her. The mind could not be Sicilia'd. It could not be evicted and managed and reduced to a piece of furniture in someone else's arrangement. It was hers in the most fundamental possible sense, the sense in which a thing is yours not because anyone has granted it to you or recognized your claim to it, but because you have built it with your own hands and understood it with your own mind, and it exists in the world in the form it takes because of you and not despite you. She had been afraid to leave that, not the place, the condition. And sitting in the pre-dawn dark of the deep chamber, in the third week of December 1882, she understood something that she would spend years trying to find the right words for in her journals, and would finally articulate simply in the last entry she ever wrote. The condition was not the mind's to give or to take. It was hers. It had always been hers. She had not found it in the Crescent Lady. She had built it here because this was where she had been given the materials and the necessity and the time. But the thing she had built was inside her, not inside the rock. She could walk out of this mountain and into the hardest room the world had to offer, and she would still be the person who had learned to hear a spring through the quality of sound in a lower passage, who had mapped tunnels that no survey had ever recorded, who had survived a Colorado winter alone at 120 feet and come out of it more whole than she had gone in. No one could throw that away. Not Cecilia. Not any version of Cecilia the world might produce. Not the foremen and supervisors and company men who had looked at her father's concerns and thanked him for his diligence and done nothing. Not anyone. She had what she had come here to find, and she had understood that she would carry it with her when she left. She was ready to leave. She told Finch in the morning. She told him simply over the tea she made each morning from the dried plants she had stacked in careful bundles on the high shelf, told him the way she had come to tell him most things directly and without ornament, because ornament was something she had lost interest in sometime in the first winter and had not found the need to recover. "I am ready," she said. He looked at her over his cup. His eyes in the morning firelight were the clear and patient eyes of a man who has arrived at his own conclusions and is waiting without impatience for the other person to arrive at theirs. When he said, "January," she said, "after the new year," he nodded. He did not say he was glad or that she was making the right decision or offer any of the reassurances that a person who had been working toward this outcome might offer to confirm it. He simply accepted it as information and returned to his tea. This was one of the things she valued most about Ezra Finch. He understood that she did not need confirmation. He had never in the weeks they had spent in this chamber together treated her as someone who required managing toward a correct conclusion. He had asked his question. She had answered it. That was the whole of it. She spent January's first weeks completing what remained to be completed. She made a final comprehensive check of every passage she had mapped, noting the places where the timber supports had settled further over the winter and the places where the walls showed new cracking from the freeze and thaw cycles of the cold months. She updated her maps with everything she had learned since October. Every new passage, every change in the water system, every detail of the mine's ongoing conversation with itself. She made 2 copies of the maps, one to take with her and one to leave. She restocked the cache. This took several days, and she approached it with the same deliberateness that Ezra Finch had brought to the original stocking 40 years ago by a different man who had understood that the right supplies in the right place could mean the difference between survival and its absence for a person who had not yet arrived. She used some of what she had accumulated over 14 months, and she gathered what she could from the surface in the brief windows of relatively passable weather that January in the Colorado high country occasionally permitted. She packed it carefully and sealed it against time. She wrote the note last. She had been thinking about what to write since she decided to do this. She had considered a great many possibilities, all of them too long or too explaining or too much about herself. In the end, when she put the pencil to the paper, what came out was the same thing that had come out of Ezra Finch when he had made his own cache decades ago for a person he could not have imagined. To whoever finds this, you have earned the right to be here. Use it well. She folded it and placed it on top of the uppermost box with a stone to hold it. She stood back and looked at the cache for a moment. Then she picked up her bag, which contained the maps and the journals and her father's watch and the compass that had been her mother's, and a change of clothes and nothing else that she could not replace, and she turned to Finch. He was standing near the hearth, his coat on his few things gathered because he was leaving too. He was going back to Durango, to the farm and the vegetable garden and the stories of the old days, and he was going to make the journey in stages this time with better weather and better planning and without the wild, stubborn urgency of a man who had decided he needed to see something before he died and had not fully accounted for the fact that he was 82 years old. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a leather roll tied with cord. He held it out to her. 40 years of mines, he said. Every one I worked, every tunnel I mapped, every place I found water or warmth or something worth knowing underground. I was going to leave them to no one in particular. I think they belong to you. She took the roll. She understood the weight of what she was holding. Not the physical weight, though the leather was thick with decades of accumulated pages, but the other weight, the weight of a lifetime of knowledge being transferred from the hands that had built it to the hands that would carry it forward. She did not have words for it. She did not look for them. She put the roll into her bag and she looked at him and he looked at her, and that was sufficient. They went up. The surface was the kind of January cold that has no interest in being described, because description requires the comfort of metaphor, and January in the Colorado high country is past the point where metaphor applies. It was simply cold functionally and completely the kind of cold that reduces the question of what you are going to do next to the single urgent question of where you are going to be warm. She had been underground for 15 months. The sky was enormous. She had forgotten this, or she had known it intellectually the way you know things about places you have been away from long enough for the immediate physical knowledge to fade into concept. But standing outside the entrance to the Crescent Lady, with the cold hitting her face and the January sky above her, the whole vast and indifferent blue of it, she felt the enormity of it as a physical experience. The sky pressing down and out in all directions, to the limit of what eyes can hold, the mountains against it, white and gray, and the pines black, and the world stretching away from where she stood in every direction, without the consolation of walls. She stood in it for a moment, just stood. Then she put her head down against the wind and she started walking. Harwick was 3 miles. She had walked it 100 times. She walked it now in the January cold, with her bag on her shoulder and her father's watch in her coat pocket, and 15 months of underground living in her body, and she did not hurry because hurry was not the right pace for what she was walking toward. She walked the way she had learned to walk, through the mind, deliberately, with full attention to where she was and what the ground under her feet was telling her. The town came up around her gradually, the way towns do when you approach them from the mountain trails. First the outlying structures, the sheds and corrals and the rough outbuildings of a working mining community, then the main street, the assay office and the general store and the saloon and the church, and all the familiar shapes of a life she had left in the dark of a September night 15 months ago. People saw her. She saw them see her. Saw the recognition move across faces that she recognized from her whole life in this town, the particular sequence of confusion and recalibration, and something harder to name, a combination of guilt and relief, and the uncomfortable awareness of a community that had watched a girl walk into the mountains and had not done much about it. They did not approach her. She did not stop. She had one thing to do in Harwick. The company house was at the end of the main street, the largest of the residential structures, the one reserved for the mine's head foreman and his family, the one that had been her home for 18 years and that had ceased to be her home in the space of one evening in September 1881. There was a new foreman now and a new family, and the house had moved on from her as efficiently as Cecilia had always intended it to. Cecilia herself was in a smaller house on the near side of town, the kind of house a widow with limited resources and limited prospects rents, when the arrangements she made for her future have not fully materialized. Marin had heard from Aldridge's men during the 3 days of the storm that the second husband Cecilia had found had proven a disappointment, which was the word they used, and which covered a range of more specific failures that Marin did not require the details of. She knocked on the door. Cecilia opened it. There was a moment. Cecilia Voss was 53 years old and looked older in the way of a woman who has spent her middle years managing a life that has consistently fallen short of her calculations and has taken the difference out of her face. Her eyes, when they found Marin's face, showed a sequence of responses that Marin observed with the detached clarity of someone watching a thing from a sufficient distance to see it whole. Shock, guilt, something that might have been relief, the relief of a person who has wondered for a long time whether something terrible happened to someone they wronged and has found that the answer is no, and feels the complicated absolution of this. And beneath all of it, the old quality that had always defined Cecilia's relationship with her stepdaughter. The assessment, the calculation. Marin waited for it to run its course. Then she spoke, and her voice was the voice she had developed in 15 months of underground living, the voice of a person who has shed everything superfluous and kept only what is essential. "I came to tell you that I am well," she said, "and to tell you that I will not be requiring anything from you." Cecilia's mouth opened slightly. Marin held her gaze for a moment longer. She let her see it. Let her see the person who had come out of the mountain. Let her see what the mountain had made of the girl she had set on the porch with a bag of clothes and a closed door. Not with anger, not with the hot desire to wound that she might have felt in the first months underground, before the mind had burned that away, along with everything else that was not essential. Simply with the clear and level regard of a person who has nothing to prove and nothing to ask for. "I don't need your understanding of what happened," Marin said. "I don't need your acknowledgement of it. I don't need your guilt or your apology or your explanation. I came here to say what I have said, and then I am going to leave." Cecilia said nothing. Marin turned and walked back up the street. That was the whole of it. There was no scene, no confrontation, no sustained reckoning of the kind that stories sometimes build toward, as though justice requires a dramatic form to be real. Just as she had learned in the deep chamber of the Crescent Lady, is not primarily a matter of dramatic form. It is a matter of who you become in response to what happens to you. She had become someone that Cecilia's closed door could not have created, and her open door could not diminish. That was the reckoning. That was enough. She found Aldridge at the survey company's temporary office in the back of the assay building. He looked up from his desk when she walked in, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has made an offer and waited months for an answer and is receiving it now in the form of the person walking through the door. "Miss Voss," he said. She sat down across from him. "I am told there is a position," she said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who has just been proved correct about something he had known from the moment he stood in the chamber and looked at the maps on the wall. "There is," he said. "Tell me what it requires," she said. He told her. It was assessment work evaluating abandoned mines across the territory for the company's consideration, determining which were genuinely exhausted and which had been left with viable ore still in them, mapping underground environments that had never been properly documented, understanding the structural integrity of workings that had been closed and forgotten, and that someone was now considering reopening. It was work that required a specific combination of skills, physical competence, in confined underground environments, the ability to read a mine's condition from the evidence. It provided the capacity to navigate in the dark without losing orientation, and the experience to know the difference between a mine that was speaking and a mine that was finished. She listened to all of it, Twaman. "It is not easy work," Aldridge said, "and the territory is wide." She looked at him. "I have been living underground for 15 months, she said, alone in an abandoned mine in a Colorado winter. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. "When can you start?" he said. She started in the spring. The winter of 1882 into 1883 gave way in its own time. The passes clearing in May, the trails becoming passable in June, the high country returning to the brief and brilliant life of a Colorado mountain summer, with the efficiency of a place that understands it has limited time and wastes none of it. By then, she had spent the intervening months in Harwick, in a rented room in the boarding house on the east side of town, doing the work of preparation for the life she was about to begin. She spent the winter studying. Not the kind of studying that happens in a schoolroom, though she had that too, working through every engineering and geology text the company could lay hands on, reading with the focused intensity of someone who already understands the practical reality of what the books are describing and is now working to build the formal vocabulary around an existing structure of knowledge. She spent it talking to every miner in Harwick who would talk to her, which once word got around about who she was and what she had done turned out to be nearly all of them, because miners are men who respect a specific kind of competence, and she had demonstrated it in the most unambiguous terms available. She spent it writing letters. One of them was to Ezra Finch at the farm outside Durango, telling him that she had taken the position and thanking him for the maps in the careful and specific way she had of expressing gratitude, which was to name precisely what the thing had meant and what she intended to do with it. He wrote back in the shaky hand of a man whose eyes were better than his fingers, 2 pages of dense practical information about 3 specific mines in the southern part of the territory that he had worked 40 years ago and that he suspected no one had looked at properly since. She used those 3 leads in her first month of work. All 3 turned out to be worth investigating. One of them turned out to be worth reopening. She was good at the work. This is not a surprise described this way, having read what came before it. But there is a particular kind of goodness at a thing that goes beyond technical competence, that has to do with the relationship between a person and the work itself, the sense of recognition and rightness that comes when a person is doing the thing they were by some combination of nature and experience and choice made to do. She had this. The other surveyors and engineers she worked with noticed it. Aldridge noticed it. The mining companies that hired the survey firm noticed it eventually in the form of recommendations from Aldridge that were consistently correct and consistently detailed in ways that exceeded what the fee structures typically produced. She became known in the territory. Not famous, not the subject of the kind of public attention that would have struck her as incompatible with the life she was building. Known in the specific community of people who worked underground and evaluated the work of other people who worked underground, known by reputation and by result known as the woman who could read a mine. Like other people read books who had learned its language from the inside. She worked for 30 years. She traveled the territory and eventually beyond it into Nevada and New Mexico and Arizona, into the mines of the Mountain West. With her father's watch in her coat pocket, and Ezra Finch's maps in her bag, and the knowledge she had built in the deep chamber of the Crescent Lady, carried in her body where no one could reach it and nothing could take it. She never married. She never had children. She wrote in her journal every night wherever she was in whatever quality of light was available, the record of what she had seen and learned and thought continuing to accumulate in the careful and precise hand she had developed in the underground months when paper was limited and every word had to earn its space on the page. Ezra Finch died in the spring of 1883, peacefully on the farm outside Durango, in the way of a man who has finished what he needed to finish and is content to let the rest go. She received a letter from a neighbor informing her 2 weeks after the fact, because she had been in Nevada when he died and the mail took time to find her. She sat with the letter for a long time in the evening of the day she received it. She thought about the chamber and the firelight and the smell of his pipe and the question he had asked her in December. She did not write in her journal that night. She sat outside under the Nevada sky, which was not the Colorado sky, but was still enormous, and she held the watch in both hands and listened to it. In the morning, she went back to work. Cecilia Voss died in 1895 in the rented house on the east side of Harwick alone. The second husband had left. The money from the company settlement for Harlan's death had been spent. The arrangements she had made for her future had produced the future they deserved, which was a small and cold one. Marin was in a mine in the southern part of New Mexico when she heard, and she thought about it for a moment with the clear and honest regard she brought to everything, and then she thought about something else. She did not go to the funeral. She was underground that day in a mine in Arizona doing the work that had become her purpose and her practice and her identity in the world. The mine was warm at depth 52 degrees, the earth keeping its own temperature against the October cold above. She moved through it with her lamp and her notebook and her father's watch and the knowledge of 40 years of underground work in her hands and her feet, and the way she breathed in a shaft that was stable versus the way she breathed in one that was not. She was thinking about the problem in the Western Passage, about whether the change in the wall color she had noticed 50 feet in was mineral variation or moisture intrusion, about what the angle of the fracture lines in the ceiling section above it suggested about the structural history of that particular section of rock. She was thinking about the mine. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Marin Voss died in January of 1941, 78 years old, in a cabin in the Colorado mountains not far from Harwick, in the long quiet of a January night, when the cold outside was the kind of cold that has no interest in drama. She had seen the century turn. She had seen the automobile and the airplane and 2 wars and the long collapse of the mining economy that had given her father his life and given her the circumstances of her own. She had watched the mountains she knew as wild and largely undocumented territory become mapped and cataloged and photographed and visited, and she had felt about this what she felt about most of the changes the years produced, which was a clear-eyed interest that contained neither nostalgia nor resistance. The world changed. The mountains did not. They found her journals in the cabin after she passed. 60 years of them packed in a trunk beside her desk. The careful handwriting of a woman who had understood from her time underground that words were tools, and that tools well kept retain their function indefinitely. The surveying company she had worked with for 30 years found the journals. A historian who was doing research on the early mining period of Colorado found them a decade later and read them and understood immediately what he had. The last entry was dated January 15, 1941, 3 days before she died. It was short. She had always preferred precision over length. She described a trip she had made on January 10th, 5 days before the entry, to the Crescent Lady. The mine had been officially closed and sealed by the State Surveying Authority in 1914, but she had noted in her records during the sealing process in which she had participated as a consultant that the original entrance she had used in September of 1881 was accessible by a secondary trail that the sealing team had not identified. She had not mentioned this to the sealing team. She had mentioned it to no one. She had gone in. She described the condition of the mine in January 1941, 59 years after she had last walked its passages. The upper levels had deteriorated significantly, the timber supports long past the point of reliable function, the shafts requiring the kind of careful and deliberate movement that she had learned in the first weeks of living there and that her body still remembered perfectly. She had gone slowly. She had gone by feel and by the knowledge still present in her hands and feet. After 60 years, the knowledge of a body that had learned this place so thoroughly that time could not fully erase it. The deep chamber was intact. The temperature was 53 degrees, 1 degree cooler than it had been 60 years ago, which she noted with the professional interest of a woman who had spent her life recording the behavior of underground environments and found the 1 degree drop interesting rather than surprising. The walls were the same ore-bearing rock, silver-streaked, the ore long since not worth the cost of extracting it, but still they're still catching the light of her lamp and throwing it back in small cold sparks. She had brought supplies. She packed them in the cache space she had used 60 years ago, against the same wall where Ezra Finch's original cache had stood in the same careful and organized way that Finch had packed his and she had repacked hers. Good preserved food, candles, blankets, a hatchet, and a knife. The things a person needs in a place like this, chosen by a woman who understood precisely what was needed because she had needed all of it once. She placed the note on top. She did not write something new. She wrote what Finch had written, the words that had been waiting for her when she arrived with a bag of clothes and a compass and no idea what came next. The words that she had used when she restocked the cache before leaving 60 years ago. The words that had passed from Finch to her and from her to whoever was coming, the long chain of human care across time. To whoever finds this, you have earned the right to be here. Use it well. She stood in the chamber for a while. She held her father's watch, which still ran, which she had wound every morning for 60 years, which kept its time in the deep chamber of the Crescent Lady as steadily as it kept it anywhere else, because a watch that has been wound faithfully does not know the difference between underground and above. She listened to it. Then she went up. She climbed out of the mountain for the last time on the afternoon of January 10th, 1941, and stood outside the entrance in the winter light of a Colorado mountain afternoon. The sky above her, the flat and serious gray of a sky that is thinking about snow. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. The mountains were white, and the pines were black against them, and the world was quiet with the particular quiet of a high country winter that has made its arrangements and settled in. She stood there for a moment, just stood. The last line of the last journal entry, the one she wrote 5 days later, does not describe any of this. She had described it already earlier in the entry with the precision she had always brought to description. The last line is something else. It is the thing she had been working toward in the 60 years of journals, in all the precise and careful record of a life built from nothing in the dark. The simplest possible version of the largest possible thing. She wrote, "The darkness taught me how to live. The light taught me why."